Tonight we're going to be back on the temple after a couple of weeks, and I just want to remind you that naturally there's still a lot that I left unsaid about the temple architecturally and archaeologically. There are many more specifics I could have given, but all this is really meant to be is just an introduction to the subject of the temple. If you can restudy this material and try to memorize and become familiar with some of the things I've had to say, then I think as you progress in knowledge in your Christian life, and we go into further studies and classes and things, then you can fill in the details about the temple some other time. And if you don't ever get around to that, I think it'd still be okay, because you've got the basics that you need to know about the temple. Now tonight what we're going to look at are some temple occupations and temple suppliers. Related occupations, first of all. And here I'm not talking about the men Herod used to build the temple, the masons and the carpenters and so forth that were hired for all of these years to build the temple, but those that were more permanently connected to the temple's service and liturgy. And I'm only going to give you maybe a 10 or a dozen or so occupations. There are many more than this. I'll certainly give you the most important ones. Again, just to kind of make you aware of the fact that what we have here with the Jerusalem temple, we're talking about the temple of the 1st century A.D., the so-called Second Temple, Herod's temple. We actually have a city within a city. The temple area, the liturgy surrounding the service and worship at the temple, was a fantastic financial deal. It cost a lot of money, and it took a lot of people in the thousands to maintain the temple services. I would kind of, and this certainly isn't an exact parallel, but I would kind of parallel the Jerusalem Temple Mount situation with the Vatican City. The Vatican City is really not part of Italy. The Vatican City is a nation unto itself. I mean, it is a law unto itself, although it's right there, the papal state in Italy, which just goes back really to the 1800s and the separation of that area and the unification of the Italian people in the 1870s. But there you've got, if you've ever been to the Vatican or you know anything about the Vatican, you've got a people there, I mean, a huge area, larger than what we're talking about, by the way, many more people, but thousands of people, just the people to run the Vatican area, the money that it takes to run that area, and money coming in from what? The faithful Catholics all over the world, kind of like the Jerusalem situation of the half or the third of a shekel coming in from all over the world to support the temple. A very similar situation here. And we well know how rich, how fabulously rich Vatican City is, with all of its ornamentation, and its coffers are certainly full. You have something similar here in the Jerusalem situation of the Second Temple of the 1st century A.D. And I think I said before, it would be similar to, I mean, Jerusalem itself is just a poor little city. There's nothing, Jerusalem doesn't have anything to offer. I mean, none of the great kings of the earth, you know, the Greeks or the Romans or the Egyptians or the Babylonians, none of them wanted to take Jerusalem and occupy it and live there forever and ever. They took it and raised the walls and went back home to better places. There are a lot better places in the world, and if you want to go by physical beauty, than Jerusalem. You just have basically a city on the top of a small hill, 2,500 feet above sea level, and nothing but barren desert, Judean desert and wilderness all around you. It is an eyesore there. But of course what makes it important is the fact that God has chosen that as a holy place. And what made it beautiful not only to the Jewish people, but to the world at large, was the beauty of the temple. Some of the things there, the temple itself being one of the ancient wonders of the world. So it'd be like a large corporation, an IBM or a General Motors plant or a General Electric plant or Ford or something, moving into a small town, and you just kind of dominate the economy and everything. Whenever let's take a GM plant. Whenever a GM plant comes into a new area in a small town, then think of right around that the glass makers and the steel suppliers and just everybody and their brother springs up as suppliers, as people to do the work and as people to supply some of the materials that are needed. at the Jerusalem service. So think of it like that. You've got people who are going to be employed by the thousands at a GM plant, and the temple is the same. And you've got all different types and varieties of suppliers who would have no need of existence. There would be no existence for them apart from General Motors moving in or the temple being what it was. So with that as a background, let's mention some of these occupations. First of all, we have the bakers. The bakers. Now back in, I'd have to look up the passage. I know back in Jeremiah's day, the bakers were an hereditary family, and they actually occupied a certain place in Jerusalem. Well, I found it, Jeremiah 37 and verse 21, because there was a street known as the Baker's Street. So the people that did the baking, the families who had the monopoly in that area, this is back in, of course, Jeremiah's day, would live in a certain area. And that becomes true of Jerusalem down through its history all the way to and through the 1st century AD, that the guilds of skilled workers or suppliers would naturally congregate in the same area. Now, we don't know in the 1st century of a Baker Street existing, but I'm just showing you back in Jeremiah's day. You had a temple in Jeremiah's day. You had the same need for bakers then that you have in the 1st century AD. So Jeremiah 37:21, then Zedekiah the king commanded that they should commit Jeremiah into the court of the prison. No love lost between the kings and the prophets, as we know. And that they should give him daily a piece of bread out of the baker's street. Now, you may never have noticed things like that, but that's one of those little historical details. Until the bread in the city, all the bread in the city were spent. Thus Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. At least he got bread. He got bread down to the end. And it came from the locale of the guild of the bakers, the Baker's Street. So moving about 600 years later to the 1st century AD, bakers, that would cover such things as the weekly showbread. Now you say, well, we're only talking about 12 sandwiches here, 12 loaves of bread. That's not a lot of work to be done. Well, that was just one thing, but that was the most important thing that the bakers would be supplying. And you couldn't just kind of get up late on Monday morning and say, I think I'll just throw some dough together here and make us some bread and take it to the temple. It had to be perfect. This was God's bread. This was holy bread. So you may spend a week looking for the right dough with the right consistency and baking the right bread until you had it right. And it would also include, and this would be a lot more involved than the showbread as far as quantity is concerned, the high priest's daily meal offering. The high priest's daily meal offering. For instance, sometimes we'll give you an Old Testament text, because a lot of this is founded way back in Mosaic law. Leviticus 24. Leviticus 24, verses 5 through 9 for the showbread. Thou shalt take fine flour and bake 12 cakes thereof. Now obviously that would be 12 would be a symbol. 12 cakes would be a symbol for the 12 tribes of Israel. 2/10 deals shall be in one cake, or they weren't cakes like we think of round, but a loaf of bread. Although their loaves of bread didn't look exactly like ours either, though. And thou shalt set them in 2 rows, 6 on a row, upon the pure table, the table of showbread, before the Lord. And thou shalt put pure frankincense upon each row, that it may be on the bread for a memorial, even an offering made by fire unto the Lord. Every Sabbath he shall set it in order before the Lord continually, being taken from the children of Israel by an everlasting covenant. And it shall be Aaron's and his sons, and they shall eat it in the holy place. This is not something you could take home. You ate the bread in the temple. For it was most holy unto him of the offerings of the Lord made by fire, by a perpetual statute. Then in chapter 6, verses 19 through 23, I believe we have the high priest's daily meal offering. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, This is the offering of Aaron and of his sons, which they shall offer unto the Lord in the day when he is anointed, the 10th part of an ephah of fine flour for meal offering perpetual, half of it in the morning, and half thereof at night, or in the evening. In a pan it shall be made with oil, and when it is baken thou shalt bring it in. The baken pieces of the meal offering shalt thou offer for a sweet savor unto the Lord. The priest of his sons that is anointed in his stead shall offer it. It is a statute forever unto the Lord. It shall be wholly burnt. For every meal offering for the priest shall be wholly burnt. It shall not be eaten. One thing eaten, one not, but both involving bread. Now, generally such jobs, such as the job of the baker, such jobs were the prerogatives of certain families, and they were hereditary in nature and right. And so, from Jewish sources, we know that the right of baking the sacred bread belonged to the family of Garmo, G-A-R-M-O, a relative of the family of Annas, high priest. Baking the bread belonged to the family of Garmo. Now, I won't say this about everything. I'll just make this point about bakers, and what I say here will be true across the board and down the line, that these generally were the prerogatives of one or more particular families. These families were inevitably related in some way to the high priesthood, and the right and duty of such occupations was hereditary. Now, they would naturally be paid for such a service. I mean, that's their job, baking bread. It's a bakery. Garmo's delicatessen, supplying bread for the temple. He's related to the family of the high priest, so I trust that, and it's hereditary in nature, so I trust that you can see the possibility of financial wrongdoing here. This is what we call a monopoly. And monopolies generally aren't good because the one who has the monopoly gets whatever price he wants. That's the whole thing about the American way. You're supposed to have competition, and competition lowers the price. Doesn't always work, but it's supposed to. And so what in the last, 5 or 10 years, what's always coming out about the United States government? That somebody has a monopoly on supplying something for the Defense Department. And as a result, you pay $900 for a screwdriver, when somebody at the Defense Department could hop in their little car and run down to Aubuchon's and pick it up themselves for a quarter. They pay $900 for it. That's what happens whenever you get favorites, and they've done you a favor, and you're doing them a favor, and so they do you a favor, and you're doing them a favor. You end up with a monopoly in that area. And what that does is drive the price up. Well, it's no big deal, I don't guess, as far as the temple people are concerned, because everybody's related. As long as you can keep the outsiders out, then you're okay. And they do a very good job of that. And that's why Jesus pours such ridicule and scorn on the money-hungry people of his day, and we'll come at that and across that again. It's because they were thieves in the temple area. Well, we've seen it before with the selling of the oxen and cattle and doves and the changers of money, but that's the point that you see in the gospel narratives. But there's a lot more besides that you have to find in extra-biblical Jewish material. So it's hereditary in nature, prerogative of a certain family, and invariably this family had ties by blood or by marriage to the high priesthood. And so what you have on your hands is a monopoly. All right, moving in the second place, beyond the bakers, to the makers of incense. They didn't have candles, so we can't do that little rhyme tonight. This belonged to the family of Euthanos, E-U-T-H-I-N-O-S. The makers of incense, E-U-T-H-I-N-O-S. I'm not aware of who controlled all of these various occupations. I'll just give you some of the names that I know of. And the reason these stand out, the reason I would even mention them, is just to say that they are related to the high priesthood. Now, in the Old Testament, back in the law of Moses, incense was needed for the altar of incense, just outside the Holy of Holies. There was a regular use of it, the altar of incense, and it had other special uses, such as the Day of Atonement. A special use was made of the sacred incense. Now, according to the writer of Hebrews, everything in the tabernacle and everything concerning the tabernacle is typical. That is, it serves as a type, or depending on maybe what it is, perhaps as a symbol if we wanted to be technical and try to draw a distinction between types and symbols. The incense being offered up, according to the 5th chapter of Revelation, was a symbol. It stood for the prayers of the people of God. Very beautiful symbol or image. It wasn't just to throw some incense on there and cloud the room up for no reason at all, but it represented, in the New Testament, we're told, the prayers of the people. Exodus chapter 30. And it had another purpose. We're going to be looking at verses 1, 7, and 9 in Exodus 30. It had another purpose on Day of Atonement, as we'll see, in that it clouded the area and obscured the presence of God. Exodus 30 and verse 1. Thou shalt make an altar to burn incense upon. Well, that's the altar burn incense. And then down to verse 7. Aaron shall burn thereon sweet incense every morning. When he dresseth the lamps, he shall burn incense upon it. In verse 9, ye shall offer no strange incense thereon. Now over in Leviticus chapter 10, we're talking there about the altar of burnt offering, and 2 sons of Aaron offered strange fire. Now that's different than strange incense, but you end up at the same place. One was on the altar of incense, and one was on the altar of offering, of burnt offering. Strange just means that which is not allowed of God. It was not according to the mixture and with the components that God had so designated. Ye shall offer no strange incense thereon, nor burnt sacrifice, nor meal offering. I mean, the sacrifice is for the other altar, not for this one. Neither shall ye pour drink offering thereon. And so all of this, you see, serves as a type of things in the future, and it serves as a type of the church. The tabernacle certainly does. You know, strange incense, that which is not allowed of God, would be those things done in the church that are not allowed of God. Certain procedures and certain practices that constitute strange worship. Strange, not in the sense of weird, but in the sense of disallowed, forbidden of God. He has a certain way he wants his church to be run and conducted, and his people to worship him and so forth, and he doesn't give us all of the boundaries, but a spirit-filled person should have a feel for those things. And I don't know about you, but I've been in some churches where there was some strange worship and strange things being done. Strange in both senses of the term. And those things are forbidden of God. And it cost the lives of the 2 sons of Aaron for offering strange fire. Not weird, but that which was not prescribed in the law. So it has its place in the church as well. Leviticus 16, verses 12 and 13. Leviticus 16 is a chapter on the Day of Atonement. He shall take a censer full of burning coals of fire from off the altar before the Lord, in his hands full of sweet incense, beaten small, and bring it within the veil. Now here's another purpose, you see. It didn't just represent the prayers of the people of God, the prayers of the saints, we're told in Revelation 5, but it was to veil the presence of God. And he shall put the incense upon the fire before the Lord. that is on the altar of burnt incense, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat that is upon the testimony, the ark of the covenant, the ark of the testimony, that he die not. You see, whenever this is back in tabernacle days, and it continued to be true down into the first century, although we know the Holy of Holies to be an empty place, void of anything in there. Whenever he opened up those curtains, before he did that, he had to have the room smoked up. Put that incense on there that would just produce the smoke just billowing off of that everywhere. And then as he had opened that curtain, that smoke would be allowed to go in there, and it'd be, well, it was already dark in there in the first place. But as you open the curtains, you're going to shed light in there. But no light would come because of how dark it was due to the incense. God was teaching them his holiness, that God is everything other than what man is. And to come into God's presence in a way disallowed of him was to result in immediate death. Once we are told that these two families, the family of Garmo and Euthanos, went on strike in the first century. And when they are seen at work again, it can be deduced that their pay was double. So evidently it was a strike over higher wages. So we find in one of the Jewish accounts. Having just discussed makers of incense, in the third place, let's go on and talk about the curtains. Constant care was needed on the temple's many, many curtains. I've only mentioned two, the famous two that separated the front from the back place in the temple. But there were many hanging around the sides. There were some on the ceiling. They were everywhere. Several layers of them. Think, first of all, in a land like the land of Palestine, how much dust would be everywhere. Remind yourself of the fact that the temple had no door on the front of it. It did have a curtain, but it was being opened all the time for the various priests to do the service in the holy place. And think how much dust accumulates in your home. Think how much dust would just be everywhere in here. And then you add with that what you don't have a problem with. You don't burn fires in your house every day and smoke the ceilings up, or you're not supposed to anyway. There are accidents if you do. Well, they did it on purpose, burning fires all the time. You've got the altar of incense that's on fire and putting incense on that, and then you've got those lamps there. Now, back in the olden days, whenever you had to heat or rather light your house that way, what happened to your walls and your ceiling? Just coated with that old sooty stuff from, what, oil being burnt. The old oil lamps there, they would just coat the ceiling with the sooty stuff. Well, you've got this all over the temple, especially on these curtains. The curtains being right beside these things where the fire was. So you've got several hundreds of people, including 82 virgin maidens. We know that number. We know they were virgins. They had a particular role in this, who were responsible for the upkeep of the curtain and for making new ones. Some of the curtains would be cleaned, others would have to be remade annually. They didn't have any self-contained vans that carpet cleaners could come in and whisk those curtains down and have them all cleaned out. You'd have to put other curtains up as replacements and take those down. And, I mean, you're not going to bring all your pots and pans and brushes inside the temple and start scrubbing in there. Those people weren't even allowed in there, these maidens, to begin with in the first place. The priests would be the ones in there who had also functions of keeping things clean regarding the curtains, who would take them down, take them out, and the maidens would have them cleaned wherever that took place. Over in Exodus 38 in verse 8, there is a reference to the fact that back in the days of the first tabernacle, there was a group of women who stationed themselves around the tabernacle and who had some type of ministry there, performed some type of service. We're not really told what, but they performed some type of service around the tabernacle. It may have had to do with something like what we're talking about now. Exodus 38 and verse 8. He made the laver of brass, really bronze. KJV brass is always bronze. And the foot of it of bronze. Of the looking glasses, now not made out of glass. They didn't have glass mirrors in those days, but of bronze. Of the looking glasses of the women. Now I know the word is italicized, but it really should be there, though. It really shouldn't be italicized. Of the women assembling. Forget your margin, assembling of troops. That doesn't have anything to do with it. The women assembling, which assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Nothing wrong with the KJV to leave it just like it is. Well, now what in the world would that mean? Well, we don't really know. Except we've just got one small, brief, cryptic reference to women. Women, not men. I mean, men were there, but they're not mentioned here. Women who performed some type of ministry and service at the door of the tabernacle of Moses, of the congregation. So we may have something similar with these 82 virgin maidens who are responsible. Expert curtain cleaners and seamstresses, I suppose, who are responsible for cleaning and making the curtains. Then in the fourth place, we have various masons, carpenters, and artificers. Now these were not the ones Herod used necessarily to build the temple. These were permanent people who were around the temple, stationed at the temple permanently for repairs. Now again, we've seen how big the temple is, a huge, huge area. So there are going to be various things that break down eventually, or something gets chipped, or something falls, or an earthquake comes and a couple of the pillars are shaken out of their stand or something. And we've got masons and carpenters and artificers, a permanent group of them around for repairs in the temple area. According to one Jewish writing, in the fifth place, we have a master of trench digging. A master of trench digging. He and his crew were responsible for the temple's water supply. Now, I mentioned just one, a master of trench digging, but he would have many, many men working under him that were responsible for cutting through the rock, that were responsible for building the aqueducts. Herod built some of these as well, with the temple treasury's money, to bring water in this very, very arid land and city into the temple. You would have to have, or into the temple area, you would have to have a continual supply of water for all these sacred washings taking place. So a master of trench digging, that's what he's called. Another related occupation was the temple barber. Now you just picture him right there under Solomon's colonnade with that little candy stripe out there. Well, he had many functions. There wasn't just one. There would be many barbers. And to be sure, they would belong to a certain family with a hereditary right in this area. He would be there, they would be there, for such things as the fulfillment of Nazaritic vows. If you turn back to Numbers chapter 6, cutting of the hair was involved. Numbers chapter 6. I mean, a complete cutting, a shaving of the head. Numbers 6, well, verse 5, all the days of the vow of his separation. You go back to verse 2 and you see vow of a Nazarite. Now this could be male or female. We generally think of Nazarites because our examples in Scripture are men, but they could be men or women. All the days of the vow of his separation, there shall no razor come upon his head until the days be fulfilled, in which he separated himself unto the Lord. He shall be holy, and shall let the locks of the hair of his head grow. Look at verse 9. Here's a case of an interruption of his vow of separation. If any man die very suddenly by him, and he hath to defile the head of his consecration, by being too close or touching a corpse, a dead man, then he shall shave his head in the day of his cleansing. On the seventh day shall he shave it, and on the eighth day, and so forth. And then look at verse 13. Here's what I really want to get to. And this is the law of the Nazarite when the days of his separation are fulfilled. I said for the fulfillment of Nazaritic vows. He shall be brought to the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. He shall offer his offering unto the Lord, one he-lamb of the first year without blemish for a burnt offering, and one ewe-lamb of the first year without blemish for a sin offering, and so forth. And the priest will make this offering for him. Verse 18, and the Nazarite shall shave the head of his separation at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and shall take the hair of the head of his separation and put it on the fire, which is under the sacrifice of the peace offerings. And the priest shall take the sodden shoulder of the ram, and one unleavened cake out of the basket, and one unleavened wafer. If you think you got a lot to remember in church, how'd you like to be a priest back in Moses' day and know what cake and who could eat it, and what if you ate the wrong one at the wrong time? And shall put them upon the hands of the Nazarite after the hair of his separation is shaven. The priest shall wave them for a wave offering before the Lord. This is holy for the priest, with the waved breast and heaved shoulder, and after that the Nazarite may drink wine. This is the law of the Nazarite who hath vowed, and of his offering unto the Lord for his separation, beside that his hand shall get, according to the vow which he vowed, so must he do after this law or vow of separation. So let's say we've got some holy men in Israel. I hope that we've still got some around in the first century who want to separate themselves to the Lord, maybe for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months. Your hair is growing and growing. It's pretty shaggy after a while. Well, you're going to have barbers on hand to take care of that. We also would need barbers for Levitical initiation. The Levites, as they were initiated into the priesthood, had their heads shaven as well. And there are probably other causes for the need of a barber than just these, but these are some obvious ones from the law of Moses. The purification of those healed of leprosy. The purification of those healed of leprosy would also have need of a barber for the shaving of their head.
For the continuation of this message,
the purification of those healed of leprosy would also have need of a barber for the shaving of their head. So there are 3 things mentioned right in the law of Moses: the fulfillment of the vows of a Nazarite, Levitical initiation, and the purification of leprous people who had been healed. That would make need for a barber. The 7th place, the temple physicians. The temple physicians. Now, they did have those in the 1st century A.D., probably for at least several reasons. Well, we could tack one on: they didn't trust God. But we don't have any tabernacle physicians back in Moses' day. Moses told the people that the Lord had said, "I am your physician." But by the 1st century, some of those people don't believe that. So the priests, who had to remain barefoot, they could not wear shoes or sandals on the temple court's flagstones, even in cold winter weather, would often slip and fall. There are many records of injuries suffered by the priests who slipped on the cold marble temple court flagstones. Remember how Herod paved all this area with marble out there. And on occasions it does ice and snow in the winter in Jerusalem. And the priests running hither and thither to do their duty would fall and slip and pull a muscle or twist this or break a bone. And there were Jewish temple physicians on hand. Also, their dietary intake was extremely high in meat, with rather little vegetable content. Now, I believe that in the Old Testament, even though this would be true then, that God could take care of his priest, his people. That was law for them. They ate certain things and didn't eat other things. But for priests who were spending a lot of time here, they had a very high meat content in their diet and very low vegetable content in their diet. Well, and it would often be very high in red meat. There were lambs and other things, but there were a lot of cattle as well. Very high in red meat. And that doesn't appear to be the best for the human body. I mean, there's nothing wrong with red meat, but to eat too much red meat, maybe in this country we eat too much red meat, it seems to have and bring along and produce its own problems. The studies that I have in my library of professionals who've looked into this area seem to substantiate this fact that red meat, a lot of red meat, too much red meat, is a leading cause for heart disease. They have found people, for instance, indigenous people, natives in the on South Sea Islands, where there has never, ever, ever, ever been a record of a heart attack or heart disease. Not a single record. Not a single record of heart disease among people that live on a lot of fish. You live on an island, obviously. You live on a lot of fish and a lot of local vegetables and fruit that is grown. The same seems to be true with people like the Eskimos. No references or records of heart disease. Heart disease, I guess you know, is one of the leading killers of men in this country. Heart disease, heart attacks, heart failure. You're always hearing of your neighbor or the next door person somewhere with a double or triple or quadruple bypass. Why his heart won't function right? Well, I'm sure that's due to a lot of things, but part of that, evidently, according to these studies, is due to too high content of meat in one's diet. You go overseas and you find that's simply not true. People who eat a lot of fish, vegetables, and fruit, and their share, but not too much, or perhaps none. No, red meat don't have heart trouble like we have in this country. So I'm just saying here might be a problem for the priest in the Second Temple. They could drink no wine. That pretty much left them with water. Those were the two staples as far as drink is concerned in Israel, wine and water. That pretty much left them then with water to drink. So I don't know that they had the best diet here. High in red meat, low in vegetable, really high in bread. I mean, everything was almost bread. All your offerings almost came with bread. No wine, only water. You may have had one or two sick or fat priests along the line. And besides these more interesting jobs, there were very many more that had to do with common things fulfilled, such things as the apothecary for the anointing oil. Remember that in the Old Testament? The holy anointing oil. We could look up these passages if we just had the time. The lamp oil. Now the anointing oil was so holy, God gave them the way He wanted it made, and He forbade them to make that for any other reason or cause. And also, He forbade any other type mixture to be used for the anointing oil and for the lamp oil. You read in the book of Exodus, and you find that the apothecary in Israel made a special type of oil. Then you would have people who provided wood for the sacrificial fires. No chainsaws, no log splitters, except your arms. And we've seen the size, 25 feet high, 75 feet square, of this altar of burnt offering. You can imagine the wood that would be necessary to keep the flames going. That would take a lot of people cutting wood and bringing wood. A lot of people to supply the wood. You'd have janitors. You'd have road sweepers. They were called road sweepers. They were part of the temple payroll, but they actually swept the roads of Jerusalem. And they swept the roads every single day. Jerusalem was a very clean city, and that was for Levitical laws of purity. The roads of Jerusalem were swept every single day by road sweepers who were employed by the temple. Pay was always very good. Pay was always given on the spot, even if a man had only worked 1 hour. This was the Near Eastern way of doing it. If you read in one of Jesus' parables, I believe it's in Matthew chapter 20, although he's not after the end of giving us Near Eastern culture, you have it in the parable here. Matthew 20, you've got the householder who goes out and he's looking for laborers in his vineyard, and he finds some early in the morning and some later in the day, and finally some at the 11th hour, and he agrees to pay them a penny, the KJV tells us, and at the end of the day, what happens? They all receive that. They're always paid on the spot. They're always paid the same day. Wouldn't that be good for you if that were true today? Your paycheck wouldn't be as much, but it'd be regular every single day. That's interesting. That was the way it was done. That's the way that it is done in the Near East today. You're paid daily. When you get through with your work, you don't go home and wait for a month to get your paycheck, or at the end of the week. You get paid then, at the end of the day. Every person gets paid then, at the end of the day. So you've got to have a lot of people keeping up. Who's going to keep the books in the temple here? Keeping the money coming in and the money going out and giving the right money to the right people. There are thousands of people employed in the temple area on various occasions to do these things. They all had to be paid that day, on the spot, even if they've only worked for 1 hour. And it all comes from the temple treasury that, well, in 1st century A.D., half shekel that's required of every Jewish male above a certain age. Throughout the diaspora, throughout the empire, you can see what that would go for now. It would take a lot of money for the temple upkeep. And then let's come to that one interesting area that we just touched on before, and some of you had some questions, and it goes back to the great size of the altar burnt offering and what we could infer, deduce from that. The blood that would be around, the blood from thousands of sacrifices. What did they do with that? As I've drawn these diagrams for you up here before, if we give ourselves the temple building here and our stairway up, our laver, our altar of burnt offering, and here we had slaughter areas, and we may have even had our big stone, which is still in Jerusalem, this big bedrock over in this area. Here's our altar of burnt offering. Well, the men, the priests, you're going to have a lot of them, but they were priests responsible for this, who were responsible for cutting up the animals, flaying them, draining their blood and so forth, and then you've got to carry them over here to the altar to put them on to be burned, or parts of them anyway. You're going to have to find some way to deal with the blood. Well, they came up with an ingenious way. I bet you didn't know this. This is going to be interesting for you to find out. Let's just give ourselves this whole Temple Mount again. I have to have the whole thing to show you the point. And here is temple area. Here's the temple, laver, slaughter area, altar of burnt offering. Here's Mount of Olives. And what's this? Kidron Valley. And this goes down, very steeply down and then steeply up the other side. Well, what they did is they bored holes underneath the Temple Mount. Various holes through here, like a drain on a concrete floor or something. And the blood was all, they didn't have to sweep it, as we'll see from one reading here in a moment. It just poured into this. They had underground tunnels that were cut in this direction, southeast, right underneath. This would be Solomon's colonnade, portico, or porch over here. Underneath that, it would come out the sides of the hill down here and drain down into the Kidron Valley, which made it a very, very fertile area. That's why we have all of those olive trees being grown over there. Very, very fertile area. And also, buyers could purchase the blood as fertilizer, and they did do that. For instance, reading from Joachim Jeremias' account of this, he writes, admittedly, the Kidron Valley is a wadi. A wadi means that it only flows seasonally, with water flowing only in the winter. Antiquities 8:17 and John 18:1. But an artificial supply which made the valley so extraordinarily fruitful was the blood of temple sacrifices. And he goes on to explain that the temple floor had these holes in it. It was sloped in a certain way in particular direction so that the blood of the sacrifices could easily be rinsed away down into the underground conduits or pipes and taken out the eastern hill of the Temple Mount, and it actually would flow down into the Kidron Valley. In other words, if you were on the Mount of Olives, you could see, especially on, let's say, a Passover time, a festival time, you would just see the blood running out like you'd see a fire hose turned on. For instance, here's one quote from the Talmud. Well, I'll read what Jeremias has to say. A considerable quantity of blood must have been involved, especially at festivals, as we see from the Talmud, according to which, here's a quote, it was a boast of the sons of Aaron to wade up to their ankles in sacrificial blood. End of quote. This reference is to blood, not in the channel, not in these things, but blood in the court of the priests itself. So we're talking about this whole area here wading to your ankles in blood. Well, could it be any other way when you're slaying 100,000 animals over a few days? Think of the amount of blood coming. A cow, an ox, they have a lot of blood in them. They waded up to their ankles in blood. I mean, it was just, as we've said before, blood city, blood everywhere, up to their ankles on these high times. And since I quoted from Jeremias, I've been meaning to mention his book, and I've brought it several times and never said anything about it. This is one of the most fascinating books that you can find on the subject of Jerusalem of the 1st century A.D., the religious environment, the cultural environment, the political environment, the social environment, and so forth. It's entitled Jerusalem in the Time of Jesus by Joachim Jeremias. He's a liberal German scholar. Now, I'll tell you a little something about this book. I had searched for it for years, trying to find it, because I knew what a good book this was. It's like a small encyclopedia. I mean, I've read it, I don't know how many times I've read the book. More than 3 times, I would say, I've read this book because there's so much information in it, so much extra biblical quoting from the Talmud and so forth. And I remember I was down at the bookstore in Manchester one day looking at the religious section, and there was this book sitting there. And I picked it up. I was talking with another brother, and I said, praise God, I've been looking for this book. I'm going to buy it now. I've been looking for it for a long time. And then as we were talking, I had this lurking thought in the back of my mind, don't buy that book. You've got that book on order. Now, I can't even remember what books I have on order. Now, I would say to myself, well, I couldn't have that on order. I've looked for that for years and haven't been able to find it. And I just hated to end up with 2 of them. So I thought, I'll put it up here, and if I do have that book on order, it'll come in within the next few weeks, and if it doesn't, then I'll come back down here and pick it up. So I put it on the shelf, and sure enough, I had evidently just found it right before that through one of the book distributors, had ordered it. It did come in. That was the same week, and then at the end of that week, or the start of the next week, I forget what, I found the book in another place through another catalog. I mean, here you've been looking for years, and you find it in 3 locations, all in the same week. Jeremias, you may never have heard of him. He's got several very interesting books, one on the parables of Jesus, one on the Eucharistic words of Jesus, where he provides and I have these books as well, where he provides a wealth of 1st century Palestinian background details. Some of the metaphors and images that Jesus uses in the parables, he gives a wealth of information on them. He is a liberal, as liberal as they come, a good German higher critic, New Testament scholar, but he's well known because he's probably one of the, in the Christian world anyway, one of the world's leading experts in Jewish studies. So he knows a lot about the Talmud and 1st century events. I know when I was in seminary, my church history professor, who would not like to be called a liberal, probably I would lump him as a liberal, because almost every quotation he gave was Joachim Jeremias. He was always quoting Joachim Jeremias. And I wondered to myself, does anybody else in this class know who Jeremias is? Do they think he's some great evangelical leader of the 15th century or something? This is a German liberal higher critic. But anyway, it's recommended, for instance, let me read you Bruce Metzger's recommendation on the back. Where does one look for information on the population of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus? What were the status and condition of slaves, both Jewish and Gentile, in the first century of the Christian era? Exactly who were the chief priests referred to so often in the Gospels and Acts? Answers to these and to hundreds of similar questions related to social and economic conditions during the New Testament period are provided in this encyclopedic volume by Joachim Jeremias. It's subtitled, An Investigation into Economic and Social Conditions During the New Testament Period. He was a professor at Göttingen. He's now dead. But you can get this through CBD for like $6 or $7 or $8. It's technical reading. You may, just because I've recommended it, you may not want to pick it up. It has footnote after footnotes. A lot of it's in Hebrew, but it is an encyclopedia in itself. It's been an invaluable book for me. I think about 400 pages. I'll pass it around. You can take a quick look at that. I know you can get it through CBD. They finally started carrying that. Whether it's worth it to you, I don't know. You have to make your mind up. Okay, quickly then, let's come to second place tonight, suppliers. We've looked at occupations, people who actually work in the temple area. Let's come to suppliers. These would be both worldwide and local. Let's deal with worldwide in the first place. Greece would be a supplier. A supplier of forms of architecture. Pillars in the temple were in the famous Corinthian capital style. The famous gate of Acts chapter 3, the beautiful gate, was made of Corinthian bronze. Corinth being a city in Greece, obviously. So Greece would be, in one sense, a supplier, at least of architectural forms and certain precious metals, bronze. Lebanon. Let me, while you're writing this down, Jeremias is wrong about several things. You won't know when he's wrong. That's a bad thing about reading anybody except the Word of God. If you don't know something in that area, you don't know when they're wrong. Jeremias is wrong about several things. He's wrong about some historical details. Sometimes you have to know who Jeremias is and what he's after. Sometimes he's got a theory that fits into some of his other New Testament studies and publications that he has, but he's trying to force into the historical account, and it just won't mesh. And I know that about Jeremias. I know what he's after sometimes. So you have to read him if you obtain that book with a grain of salt. I have found it just fascinating. Every time I pick up the book, I can hardly put it down. It's got such a wealth of information. When he packs into one sentence, you wouldn't believe how much information you have in one sentence on, some small detail, just a small detail concerning economic or social conditions around the first century area. Lebanon, cedar wood from Lebanon was used to panel the roofs of the various colonnades. I've mentioned that before. Cedars of Lebanon. If you go to Lebanon today, there aren't very many cedars of Lebanon left. I think the Jews are to blame for that. Well, not really, because they were exported all over the world. They were so famous for their height and their size, and especially their resistance to rotting. Sidon, the city of Sidon, up in Phoenicia. Glassmaking was a special art here. So the temple was supplied with their dishes and bowls. That's what I mean. I don't mean glass as we think of glass, but their dishes and bowls. The neighboring city of Tyre, famous for its fish, Nehemiah 13:16. Its pottery or glass making. Many different dishes and bowls would have to be supplied in around the temple. And its costly purple dye. extracted from a Mediterranean fish. Remember in Acts 16, Lydia was a seller of purple. Well, you can't sell purple. Purple's just an abstraction. It's got to be purple something. Well, purple dye. Lydia was a seller of purple dye. The island of Cyprus was famous for its dried figs. Babylonia for its woven garments, such as some of those that were worn by the priests and the Levites, and its various tapestries and hangings in blue and scarlet and purple. In other words, the cloth, much if not most of the cloth for the hangings in the temple was imported from Babylonia into Jerusalem. You know, you kind of find that interesting that Babylon was the nation that came and destroyed the temple. And here the Jews turned right around and looked to Babylon for its fine cloth in blues and scarlets and purples. Fabrics for the temple also came from India, I might add. Then whatever number we're on, Arabia. There were others, but I'll end here worldwide with Arabia. Arabia supplied the precious gems and spices needed for such things as the oils and incense, precious gems needed for the high priest's ephod. Remember, he wore this ephod and he had his precious stones or gems across the front of it. These would be supplied by Arabia. Now, the reason we have so many suppliers, the fact that we have so many suppliers, I should say, tells us something else about the city of Jerusalem. It had a severe shortage of raw materials. Look at all these various materials coming from all these various pagan lands. Jerusalem had a severe shortage of raw materials, and Jeremias does a fine job documenting this fact. The only raw material that Jerusalem had in any quantity was stone, which was excellent for all the building work that went on, but you need a little more than stone around there. No good metals, no rich ore are found in this area. The neighborhood clay is very inferior. You've got better clay down in Jericho, but that's quite a distance away, and you can find better clay than that in other places of the world. Most serious of all is Jerusalem's lack of water. It rains very little in Jerusalem. That's why you have all of your pools and cisterns there. The pool of Siloam, the pool of Bethesda, which were basically cisterns, and you do have a few springs, like Gihon Spring and Hezekiah's Tunnel that was cut to bring that under the city wall and into the city proper. But you've got a severe shortage of water. About all that area Jerusalem could produce were the products and byproducts of cattle, sheep, and olive trees. The products and byproducts of cattle, sheep, and olive trees. Those products and byproducts would be then leather, wool, animal hides, meat, wood, oil, and olives, that is olive oil. Leather, wool, hides, meat, wood, oil, and olives. Whatever you can get from cattle, sheep, and olive trees. And then let's conclude our study tonight with the local suppliers. Judea, I just gave you that, supplied tremendous quantities of olive oil needed in the temple service. That above cattle and sheep by far. Tremendous quantities of olive oil. There's still a Garden of Gethsemane. It evidently has trees that go back probably 2,000 years ago. That's how old some of those trees are. They're olive trees. Gethsemane, the name, means an olive press. So you would have to, if that's the Garden of Gethsemane, an olive press where you're pressing oil out of the olives, there must be a very large growth of olive trees. And the rocky soil and little rain is very conducive to the growth of olive trees. There's Judea. The rest of Israel, well, wheat needed to make flour to make the bread and cakes for the thousands of meal offerings and the showbread and so forth. Wheat would come from basically northern Israel. That is up in Galilee. That's where you have your great plains, the plain of Esdraelon, the valley of Megiddo. The coastal plain, sometimes in geography it's called the maritime plains, but the coastal plain would supply calves. And then Transjordan, that area known often as Decapolis or Perea, Transjordan would supply livestock, especially rams. All right, so that gives us the local suppliers. Judea with its olive oil, northern Israel with its wheat. You got to have a lot of wheat to make the flour, to make the dough, to make the bread. And the coastal maritime plains to the west would supply many calves, and then finally Transjordan would major in livestock, especially rams. Remember the 2.5 tribes, whenever they came into the land, they didn't want to cross the river. Why? They wanted to stay there in Transjordan. We have great herds. This land is conducive to herds. Israel proper, especially southern Israel, Judea, is not that conducive to the raising of the type of livestock that you would need. Transjordan, Perea, up in the Decapolis area was very conducive to this, and that's why the 2.5 tribes, who were very blessed in that area of livestock, wanted to remain in that part of the country and not cross over the Jordan River.